I please call upon stage Mr. Abhishek Murali, Senior Analyst, Rystad Energy, who will be speaking on battery storage, understanding the market potential and its role in the new global energy system. May I please welcome Mr. Abhishek Murali on stage, please.
So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak at the conference. We've seen a lot of companies here that have shown their technology, that have shown their future plans. So what I would like to do today is sort of look at this from the market perspective. I'm Abhishek Murali, and I work as a senior analyst in the battery markets research team at Rystad Energy. So who are we? We are a market intelligence company that began as an oil and gas consultancy in 2004. We are based out of Oslo, Norway. And over the last few years, we have sort of understood that there is a need to cover new technologies that have become key to the energy transition. And one of the major ones is the battery market space. We pride ourselves on reliable data and projections. We follow the philosophy at Rystad Energy of bottom-up. We collect asset-level data. We connect granular data down to the plant level, what investments are being made, how much capacity is, and use this to build our forecasts, which we share with clients to hopefully aid their business-making decisions. We, as I said, began out of Oslo, but have since expanded our coverage to over 20 cities, sorry. And we are present in all the key major markets and cover, again, all the key energies that are present around the world. So what I would like to do today is sort of give you an overview of how the global energy transition is heading and how does the energy mix evolve as we head out to 2050 and then the second half of this century. We will then look at what role does battery energy storage have to play over here. We have talked about electric vehicles as a main driver, but battery energy storage has a huge role to play when we talk about even meeting our renewable energy ambitions. And finally, with these trends and drivers in mind in different countries, are we really on track to meet net zero goals that have been set out in the Paris Climate Agreement? So looking at global energy transition, this is a picture that we normally like to show to clients as what we encapsulate is the global energy system. We call it moving from molecules to electrons. And what we mean by that is we're moving from an era of fossil fuel generation, which is coal, natural gas, petroleum, down to electrons, or rather renewable energy, hydro energy, solar, wind, you name it. But we are very clearly moving right from the bottom to the top. But at the same time, if you move towards the right, what we are noticing is an increase in end-use sectors for energy. The world is growing as it is. We have India as the greatest example that not only are countries increasing their energy demands, but are finding new application sectors for which energy is needed. So where does battery energy storage have a role to play here? But it is very clearly the top four that you see over there. Battery energy storage is trying to solve the problem of intermittency. We normally associate the top four as very intermittent sources. They are very much dependent on where natural resource availability is. Is the wind flowing at the right time? Is solar available? Possibly the best example for this is the European market and what happened during the winter months when the sun was not shining and there was very low wind speeds. And so when you do not have generation that is guaranteed, we currently turn towards baseload generation, which is again coal and oil. But if we do want to move away from them, there needs to be a way to store energy, and that is where battery energy storage comes in very handy. If we look at primary energy consumption's evolution throughout the years, we're clearly seeing a very big uptrend. And over the last 50 to 100 years, it's not been that much increase in renewable energy generation, but rather just that as the world's energy requirement continues to increase, each generation source is increasing its capacity. But there's not really been a displacement of oil and gas. However, post-COVID and post the Russia-Ukraine war, what we have seen is an increased investment into renewables. But more so, if we do want to meet the goals set out in the Paris Climate Agreement, we have to deploy renewables very quickly. And so what we see is, as we reach the second half of this century, that's 2050 and beyond, we're starting to see that more than 50% of generation is going to come from non-fossil fuel sources. And very clearly, the biggest of this is going to be solar generation. And so when we talk about it, clean energy is really the preferred carrier for the future. And if you look towards the chart over here, again, just 2050 and beyond, more than a third of generation is going to come from electricity via storage. And so this is not just electricity that is generated on demand. This is stored and forms a very key part of the global energy power mix. But also, we have heard about this thing known as the energy trilemma. And this was something that has been going on for a very long time, where we talk about reliability, affordability, and sustainability. Everybody wants energy, and energy needs to be affordable for everyone. But what recent policies, such as in the US and in Europe, have shown is that energy sovereignty has a very key role to play. People want their energy to be sourced locally, to be manufactured locally, and they do not want to be dependent on other countries for their energy needs. Very simply, we've seen that Germany and most of the Western European countries have been very dependent on Russia for natural gas, and this has put them in a very precarious situation. So we need to find these solutions to move away from natural resources not being available, and battery energy storage definitely has a key role to play here. So let's look at some of the market outlooks, what we have been observing in different countries, and what are the reasons for growth in these countries. So as we've mentioned, renewable energy will account for 70% of generation by 2050 per our estimates. And this is just in our base case energy transition. The accelerated energy transition has more than 85% of generation coming from renewables by 2050. So you can see the market potential is very clearly present for allied services along with renewable energy. And so the battery energy storage era has just begun. We're moving from just under 25 gigawatt of annual installation, and we are predicting that by 2045, the peak will require around 200 gigawatt of annual installation. Again, this is not accumulated. This is installation every single year that needs to be done in order to meet our goals. When we look at it, Asia is definitely going to be the biggest driver, and the two key markets will be China and India. And I will touch upon China in an upcoming slide. But what we can also see is that there is a sort of peak that is being reached. And we say that as we reach 2050, the primary demand for energy starts to come down as we become more efficient at exploiting existing energy we have. Because one of the major things, if you look back in the previous chart, is that a lot of energy that we're generating right now is gone away in losses. And what we believe is that by 2045, newer technology and more efficient methods will make sure that our primary energy consumption is much less for the final use later on. And in order to meet these goals of renewable energy, we did say that by 2030, there needs to be a 10 times growth in battery energy storage installed. And so it will rise to around 400 gigawatt hour towards the end of this decade alone. Again, China will play the major role over here. It will account for almost half of this 420 gigawatt hour by 2030. And it is a very key market because China is very self-sufficient when it comes to installing their own energy storage. But if their demand is increasing and they have to then supply their own countries, the remaining countries in the world need to start looking at solutions outside of China. So what are these other countries doing? Well, probably the biggest country at the forefront is the United States, especially after the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act policy. What we've seen with the IRA is that they have brought in massive investments in the form of investment tax credits and production tax credits. More than 10 to 15% of a project's capex is going to be incentivized by the government as long as you are manufacturing the components within the country. What we've seen after this is just in the last 1 year of the policy being announced, there has been an increase of 120 times in the projects announced from towards the end of this decade. And the IRA alone is adding over 15% of this capacity by 2030. So due to this, we are saying that by 2030, there will be a demand for 500 gigawatt hour of battery market storage accumulated by 2030. And so there is a huge potential in the US market as well. And they are looking for partners outside of China, but also outside countries of national concern for them. And India happens to be a major partner for them. In Europe, there is a very different sort of system that's going on, and that is the rise of residential energy storage. So residential energy storage is what we refer to as behind the meter. They are battery systems installed for just specifically home usage, and they're not really connected to the grid. The rise of residential energy storage is very closely linked to the penetration of rooftop solar mainly. And rooftop solar has been heavily incentivized in countries such as Germany and Italy, for example, where we look at almost 10 to 20% of the cost for installing rooftop solar and the allied battery energy storage being subsidized by the government. So due to this, we are seeing about 12 gigawatt hour of demand by 2030 in just the residential energy system alone. And this is a market that is ripe for tapping when we consider the heavily increased prices of electricity generation in Europe. But regardless, utility systems will also have a role to play. We do need grid-tied batteries in order to go through demand, in order for peak shifting and peak shaving. And we estimate that this demand would be about 56 gigawatt hour by 2030, with again Germany and Italy leading the way. However, there is a certain problem here that arises in terms of tendering and permitting that we have seen when we talk to EPCs and project developers in Europe, is that the governments are not being as proactive enough in passing tenders, in ensuring that the right FID rates are reached in order to meet these projects. So there is a sort of synergy here that needs to be played by the market as well as the government. For China, however, the story is just about growth and more growth. We are estimating that from just under 5% of energy generation coming from storage, it's set to rise to 10% by 2030. And as I mentioned in a previous chart, more than half of the demand in 2030 is coming from China alone. And this equates to about 230 gigawatt hour of energy storage. And China is researching on a multitude of technologies. So as I will show in one of my later slides, this is not just lithium ion that is actually meeting this demand for them by 2030. But before we move over to chemistry trends, I would just like to maybe quickly look at long-term versus short-term duration. If you had noticed in a few of our slides, most of our projects are in the range of 4 to 6 hour project duration. And when we talk to project developers, we see that this is the ideal time frame for a project when it comes to cost versus technology limitations. But what we're seeing in China is also the penetration of even 8 and 10 hour systems that are able to deliver peak energy. So these are systems that are close to 300 megawatt and 3 gigawatt hour. So what we are seeing that by 2030, in fact, and even by 2025 alone, is that long-term duration, long-term energy storage will capture most of this utility market. And long-term energy storage has a very big role to play because right now we are looking at solutions such as hydrogen and others in order to meet long-term demand. But if batteries are able to crack this 8 to 10 hour barrier, there's a huge market potential again in many of these countries, especially in some place like India. Looking at chemistry trends, out of the 95 gigawatt hour that was installed by 2022, more than 95% of this was around lithium ion technology. And this is really no surprise when we look at just how much more advanced this technology is. Even within lithium ion technology, if you look to the graph in the right, the main penetration has been the NMC chemistry. But in the last 3 years, in just lithium-ion technology, again, with China being the main driver, we have seen a rise in LFP technology penetration. And what we are saying is that the technology is so much more competent, as it's just a matter of time before it hits the remainder of the world. And by 2030, we are saying that the NMC market is not going to be as prevalent. Again, this is on a global scale. So you'll still find markets such as America that have a very high NMC penetration. But on a global scale, LFP is definitely the technology way to go. We also heard a presentation on sodium ion. And as a company, we are very bullish on sodium ion penetration, especially post-2030. We believe that the cost advantages are much greater than technology limitations that would plague energy storage compared to, let's say, electric vehicles. But when you look towards newer technology, these are some of the technologies when we speak to project developers, they are the most optimistic about. And what we are most optimistic about here is sodium ion. As we see that if we just look at the text in red, which is some of the limitations we see, most of these limitations for sodium ion can easily be worked around. Low production volumes is a byproduct of companies not really investing yet into this technology. And cycling efficiency, something that we see is a problem with electric vehicles, is also being actually worked upon. So if you look at companies such as CATL or even the Chinese company Hina, they have managed to improve cycling efficiency to the point of deploying sodium ion in electric vehicles. Vanadium flow is another really useful chemistry when we talk about reaching peak power versus peak energy. But again, vanadium toxicity is a concern that is stopping this technology from reaching its goals, especially in US and Europe. So when we look at these market drivers, are we really on track to meet net zero goals? So the first thing is that we require around 2.2 terawatt hour of accumulated capacity to reach goals in the 1.5 degree scenario. Now, when I say 1.5-degree scenario, this corresponds to the IPCC carbon budget that is available in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. And as you can see, we are already like quite lagging behind when trying to meet this goal. But however, some of the scenarios that we see below, which are still good enough and better than doing nothing, that there are scenarios that current market trends can definitely reach. The current market trend that we see, the pathways when it comes to project installations, projects being risked, and pipelines that we have established, it is enough to secure the 1.9-degree scenario that we see. Yes, the graph that you see on 1.5 degree is really very high and it grows exponentially, but there is a way for the market to definitely reach it. And so with that, I'd like to thank you, and I will be available in the conference today and tomorrow, and would be glad to discuss some of our outlooks on other energy sectors as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abhishek Murali, for your detailed insights. May I please take the honor and share a token of appreciation on behalf of Informa Markets India.